Chapter 7 of Through the Looking-Glass by Lewis Carroll. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 7. The Lion and the Unicorn. The next moment soldiers came running through the wood, at first in 2s and 3s, then 10 or 20 together, and at last in such crowds that they seemed to fill the whole forest. Alice got behind a tree, for fear of being run over, and watched them go by. She thought that in all her life she had never seen soldiers so uncertain on their feet. They were always tripping over something or other, and whenever one went down, several more always fell over him, so that the ground was soon covered with little heaps of men. Then came the horses. Having 4 feet, these managed rather better than the foot soldiers, but even they stumbled now and then, and it seemed to be a regular rule that, whenever a horse stumbled, the rider fell off instantly. The confusion got worse every moment, and Alice was very glad to get out of the wood into an open place, where she found the White King seated on the ground, busily writing in his memorandum book. "I've sent them all," the King cried in a tone of delight on seeing Alice. "Did you happen to meet any soldiers, my dear, as you came through the wood?" "Yes, I did," said Alice. "Several thousand, I should think." 4,207, that's the exact number, the King said, referring to his book. "I couldn't send all the horses, you know, because 2 of them are wanted in the game. And I haven't sent the 2 messengers either, they're both gone to the town. Just look along the road, and tell me if you can see either of them." "I see nobody on the road," said Alice. "I only wish I had such eyes," the King remarked in a fretful tone. "To be able to see nobody, and at that distance too, why, it's as much as I can do to see real people by this light." All this was lost on Alice, who was still looking intently along the road, shading her eyes with one hand. "I see somebody now," she exclaimed at last, "but he's coming very slowly, and what curious attitudes he goes into!" For the messenger kept skipping up and down, and wriggling like an eel as he came along, with his great hands spread out like fans on each side. "Not at all," said the King. "He's an Anglo-Saxon messenger, and those are Anglo-Saxon attitudes. He only does them when he's happy. His name is Heya." He pronounced it so as to rhyme with mayor. "I love my love with an H," Alice couldn't help beginning, "because he is happy. I hate him with an H, because he is hideous. I fed him with ham sandwiches and hay. His name is Heya, and he lives—" "He lives on the hill," the King remarked simply, without the least idea that he was joining in the game, while Alice was still hesitating for the name of a town beginning with H. "The other messenger's called Hatta. I must have 2, you know, to come and go, one to come and one to go." "I beg your pardon?" said Alice. "It isn't respectable to beg," said the King. "I only meant that I didn't understand," said Alice. "Why one to come and one to go?" "Didn't I tell you?" the King repeated impatiently. "I must have 2, to fetch and carry, one to fetch and one to carry." At this moment the messenger arrived. He was far too much out of breath to say a word, and could only wave his hands about and make the most fearful faces at the poor King. "This young lady loves you with an H," the King said, introducing Alice in the hope of turning off the messenger's attention from himself, but it was no use. The Anglo-Saxon attitudes only got more extraordinary every moment, while the great eyes rolled wildly from side to side. "You alarm me," said the King. "I feel faint. Give me a ham sandwich." On which the messenger, to Alice's great amusement, opened a bag that hung round his neck, and handed a sandwich to the King, who devoured it greedily. "Another sandwich," said the King. "There's nothing but hay left now," the messenger said, peeping into the bag. "Hay, then," the King murmured in a faint whisper. Alice was glad to see that it revived him a good deal. "There is nothing like eating hay when you're faint," he remarked to her as he munched away. "I should think throwing cold water over you would be better," Alice suggested, "or some sal volatile." "I didn't say there was nothing better," the king replied. "I said there was nothing like it," which Alice did not venture to deny. "Who did you pass on the road?" the king went on, holding out his hand to the messenger for some more hay. "Nobody," said the messenger. "Quite right," said the king. "This young lady saw him too, so of course nobody walks slower than you." "I do my best," the messenger said in a sulky tone. "I'm sure nobody walks much faster than I do." "He can't do that," said the king, "or else he'd have been here first. However, now you've got your breath, you may tell us what's happened in the town." "I'll whisper it," said the messenger, putting his hands to his mouth in the shape of a trumpet, and stooping so as to get close to the king's ear. Alice was sorry for this, as she wanted to hear the news too. However, instead of whispering, he simply shouted at the top of his voice, "They're at it again!" "Do you call that a whisper?" cried the poor king, jumping up and shaking himself. "If you do such a thing again, I'll have you buttered. It went through and through my head like an earthquake." It would have to be a very tiny earthquake, thought Alice. "Who are at it again?" she ventured to ask. "Why, the lion and the unicorn, of course," said the king. "Fighting for the crown?" "Yes, to be sure," said the king, "and the best of the joke is that it's my crown all the while. Let's run and see them." And they trotted off, Alice repeating to herself as she ran the words of the old song. The lion and the unicorn were fighting for the crown. The lion beat the unicorn all round the town. Some gave them white bread, some gave them brown, some gave them plum cake, and drummed them out of town. "Does the one that wins get the crown?" she asked, as well as she could, for the run was putting her quite out of breath. "Dear me, no," said the king. "What an idea!" "Would you be good enough," Alice panted out, after running a little further, "to stop a minute, just to get one's breath again?" "I'm good enough," the king said, "only I'm not strong enough. You see, a minute goes by so fearfully quick. You might as well try to stop a bandersnatch." Alice had no more breath for talking, so they trotted on in silence till they came in sight of a great crowd, in the middle of which the lion and unicorn were fighting. They were in such a cloud of dust that at first Alice could not make out which was which, but she soon managed to distinguish the unicorn by his horn. They placed themselves close to where Hatta, the other messenger, was standing watching the fight, with a cup of tea in one hand and a piece of bread and butter in the other. "He's only just out of prison, and he hadn't finished his tea when he was sent in," Heya whispered to Alice, "and they only give them oyster shells in there, so you see he's very hungry and thirsty. How are you, dear child?" he went on, putting his arm affectionately round Hatta's neck. Hatta looked round and nodded, and went on with his bread and butter. "Were you happy in prison, dear child?" said Heya. Hatta looked round once more, and this time a tear or two trickled down his cheek, but not a word would he say. "Speak, can't you?" Heya cried impatiently, but Hatta only munched away and drank some more tea. "Speak, won't you?" cried the king. "How are they getting on with the fight?" Hatta made a desperate effort, and swallowed a large piece of bread and butter. "They're getting on very well," he said in a choking voice. "Each of them has been down about 87 times." "Then I suppose they'll soon bring the white bread and the brown," Alice ventured to remark. "It's waiting for 'em now," said Hatta. "This is a bit of it as I'm eating." There was a pause in the fight just then, and the lion and the unicorn sat down panting, while the king called out, "10 minutes allowed for refreshments." Heya and Hatta set to work at once, carrying rough trays of white and brown bread. Alice took a piece to taste, but it was very dry. "I don't think they'll fight any more to-day," the king said to Hatta. "Go and order the drums to begin." And Hatta went bounding away like a grasshopper. For a minute or two Alice stood silent, watching him. Suddenly she brightened up.